This is a story of what happens when the Victorian revivalists at Bradbury and Bradbury Wallpapers in Benicia, California, discover a plain white room in the city of San Francisco. Like many stories, it begins long ago and far away. Here's Bruce Bradbury.
When I was a child, I had a recurring dream. I'd climb up into the attic and discover a secret door that led down a long, dark passageway. At the far end, in a shimmering light, lay a strange and wonderful room of absolutely ethereal beauty. Every surface was exquisitely colored and ornamented with the richest materials of the imagination. Standing there in total awe, I'd notice another door on the far side. I'd step through into a room totally different, but even more beautiful than the last. And so it continued. I'd spend the night wandering through an unending dream palace. A few months ago, standing in the middle of the studio here in Benicia, the dream came flooding back in full clarity. I realized I've spent most of my life trying to transform a long-forgotten childhood dream into a reality.
What attracts Bruce to the Victorian period is the unabashed celebration of color and ornament. He began his color studies by trying to locate original, untouched Victorian interiors, but he soon discovered that they can be misleading.
Many colors are fugitive. That means that they fade and alter when exposed to light. Many original Victorian interiors are merely chromatic ghosts of their former selves. This is the main reason that Victorian interiors have such an undeserved reputation for gloom. Most of us have been looking at faded colors, which are in turn covered by the accumulated grime of a century.
During the 19th century, wallpaper was considered an art form, so many unfaded original Victorian wallpapers can be found in museums, such as the Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
This is one of my favorite books. I've had it now for about 10 years. And I started it originally to enable me to take color notations in the museums in Europe off original samples of papers that I found and bring them back, the notes back to my paint studio here and remix the colors in their proper combination. The key that really allows me to do that is called the Munsell color system.
Another major source of inspiration is found in design folios of the period.
This is one of my favorites. It's called Polychromatic Decoration and is by some of the leading architects and decorators in London from the period of 1880. We're fortunate that this one has a complete palette on the front describing a system of colors for the use in the 19th century interior.
Here in the art department, the designers at Bradbury and Bradbury are attempting to go beyond just copying specific designs and colors. They're working to recreate a coordinated system of design and color that is both authentic to the 19th century and of practical use to the 20th century homeowner. Nearly every afternoon, a group gathers for the daily design meeting. Some people think that B&B is the result of one fevered imagination, but the reality is far different. Since the earliest days, the designs and colorings have been the result of give-and-take discussions among a dedicated group of young historians and designers. Sometimes they even manage to end the meeting with a consensus, and sometimes not. Whatever the case, Bruce's suggestions are always met with due respect.
The actual production of hand-printed wallpaper is a painstaking task. Each color in a design requires its own separate piece of artwork and must be in perfect registration with its companions. Nearly all of our intricate designs are individually cut by hand using an X-Acto blade. It's somewhat similar to cutting a stencil. Corner marks are applied on each separate sheet to ensure that they will line up properly when printed. Once separate sheets have been cut for all the colors in a design, they receive a final check for registration and are then ready to be photographically transferred to a silkscreen. Silkscreen printing is a development of an ancient Japanese stencil technique. The screen is a wooden or metal frame on which fabric is tightly stretched. In the old days, the fabric actually was silk. The screen is coated with a thin film of photosensitive emulsion in a darkroom, and the individual sheets of artwork are photographically transferred onto the screen. The result is very much like a stencil. The white areas you see are clear fabric through which paint can be forced with a rubber-bladed squeegee.
Before printing, all the colors for the pattern are mixed by hand. They use the same basic pigments that Victorian designers used, and they mix all of their colors by eye rather than by formula. When a design is first introduced, its colors go into the master color book, and all subsequent printings are compared to the original. When the paints are prepared, printing is then ready to start.
We hand print down tables that are 92 feet long. Each table holds 6 rolls of wallpaper. There's a separate screen for each color in a design, so it's easy to see why hand printing is a time-consuming task. The screen is hand-placed in position for every stroke, and some of our more complex designs require as many as 5,000 individual impressions to make enough wallpaper for a good-sized room. Any mistake made along the way can ruin a whole roll of goods, so printing requires a rare combination of physical stamina and meticulous craftsmanship.
Once the papers are printed, combining them in true 19th century fashion is the job of their design service. Paul Duchscherer, Director of Design Service, explains.
What we have here is a drawing that is the solution to that particular job, and it was just a bedroom in the house. Perhaps it'll lead to other rooms, we hope, but at the moment it's a simple upstairs bedroom done in the East Lake room set, and this shows that we were confronted with a room that had one of its corners cut off, which is a fairly typical situation, and our solution was to create an asymmetrical form out of a border, and our various components in this particular room set and in all the other ones as well allow a lot of different variations to come up with lots of sometimes off-the-wall solutions which are very much in character with designers of the 19th century.
Many clients design their own wall and ceiling combinations themselves. Jan McHarg, Head of Customer Services, is always ready to answer questions and help people with their orders by phone.
And then you can have the ground paper showing through in between.
Although B&B is very small as far as wallpaper companies go, we have one of the world's largest research laboratories just across the bay. San Francisco.
San Francisco is a Victorian lover's dream. More than 13,000 Victorian buildings still exist, many of them lovingly restored. The row houses of San Francisco are world-renowned for their flamboyant millwork and brightly painted exteriors. But behind these exuberant facades often lurks the nemesis of the Victorian revivalist, the plain white room. Bill Westbrook, a San Francisco homeowner, asked Bradbury and Bradbury for help with a bare white parlor in his 1890 house.
Whenever I walk into a Victorian and see a plain white room, I feel that something is terribly wrong. It's as if all the color, all the magic, all the warmth and vitality of the original had been slowly stripped away over the years, leaving only a bleached skeleton. Fortunately, many plain white rooms still bear traces of their colorful pasts, and a little detective work can provide clues that help us restore them to their true 19th century splendor. In Bill's parlor, the first thing that catches our eye is the brilliantly colored panes of flashed glass that surround the upper part of the windows with squares of bright orange, bright blue, and plum. Luckily, the original mantel is still in place, and the original tiles of the fireplace surround give us our very best clues. Across the top is stretched a blossoming branch in the Japanese style, telling us that this house, like so many other Victorians, had been touched by the craze for all things Japanese that was so prevalent in America in the 1870s through the 1890s. The tiles on the side reveal a motif of potted sunflowers, again Japanese-inspired, and also the symbol of the English aesthetic movement. The soft purple-brown glaze of the surround tiles is accented by the cream, ochre, and olive tiles at the base of the fireplace. The last clue is found by examining the door hardware. In this instance, it's not Japanesque, but rather a type of Victorian Gothic inspired by the Eastlake style, so we know that the room was not all one precise style, but rather a typical eclectic Victorian mix.
Now we have some basic material to work from, a color palette of cream, ochre, olive, and purple, accented by brilliant blue, orange, and plum, a combination of colors likely to send a devoted modernist running for cover, but one to quicken the pulse of the true Victorian lover. Design Service now searches through the collection for a series of patterns and colors that will harmonize with the various hues and motifs discovered in the room.
We don't have to worry about recreating the shades of the tiles exactly. Repeating the exact same colors for wallpaper, paint, and fabric in a room is a modern design fetish that would confuse and disappoint the Victorian eye. The best explanation of this lies in nature. Look at a leaf. It's not one single shade of green, but rather a combination of greens, as you notice the areas of highlight and shadow. Understanding this concept, the Victorians used slight variations of shades and hues together in the same room to achieve a subtlety of coloring that echoed nature.
With the patterns and palette chosen, we now turn our attention to polychroming the plasterwork in the room. Polychrome is a word derived from the Greek. It means many-colored, and is perhaps the best single-word description of the Victorian interior. Plaster cornices were frequently polychromed, sometimes in soft, subtle pastels, and sometimes in bright, bold colors. Bill Westbrook, like many homeowners, was actively involved in all aspects of the room design. He chose the colors, and he hand-painted his own cornice and rosette.
While there are no hard and fast rules for polychroming plaster, here are some helpful hints. Rounded protruding rails are often finished with metallic gold to catch the light. The cove, often the largest surface of the cornice, is treated with an intermediate color. The narrow areas can be treated with bold accent colors, outlined with pinstripes of black. The colors that Bill chose were developed from the wallpapers that will soon be hung, so the end effect is guaranteed to be harmonious. For the rosette, Bill chose to give a naturalistic effect to the ivy leaves by painting them with a green shade taken from the wallpaper frieze. Receding areas are often best painted with dark receding colors, and again gold is added to the protruding curved areas, and a narrow circlet of brilliant blue is added as a final accent. One caution: with the walls still white, the cornice and rosette are likely to appear too dark and too bold. But remember that all the bright white in the room will soon disappear. If the cornice appears in perfect balance with a white room, it's likely to be too pale once the room is fully colored.
With the plaster fully painted, the final and most exciting part of preparation is next, transferring the scale drawing from design service onto the ceiling itself as a guide for paper hanging. Holly Fisher, one of Bradbury and Bradbury's favorite paper hangers, measures the various border and panel areas of the ceiling. With Bruce's help, she uses a chalk line to snap the required guidelines onto the ceiling. When they finish, the design service drawing has been transferred to the ceiling and the room is ready for hanging. Dean Darby, a member of the National Guild of Paper Hangers, explains how it's done.
In preparation for hanging, the papers are dry trimmed, then they are pasted. Some might think that an ornate ceiling of many parts is more difficult to hang. But the truth of the matter is that it's much easier than hanging an overall ceiling paper, because the individual pieces are smaller and easier to handle. The most difficult part is putting up the very first strip, because in most Victorians it is necessary to work around an elaborate plaster rosette. Holly will show you how it's done. A line is drawn that is centered on the rosette. The first sheet is put up using that line as a guide. That way, it is necessary to cut around only half the rosette at a time. Make as many relief cuts as necessary to allow the paper to lie flat. After the paper is in place, carefully complete the trimming around the rosette. After the two center strips are up and trimmed, the rest go up quite easily, filling the area that becomes the central panel. The next step is to hang the enrichment. Enrichment is a richly colored pattern that extends around the perimeter of the room. When the enrichment is complete, the borders are put in place. We start with a small 1-inch dot border. The next border is a 3-inch zigzag design known as the sawtooth. Notice that with the completion of these two borders, we have moved out from the wall the exact distance of the chimney breast. The chimney breast often determines the measurement and placement of borders on a ceiling. Now we install the main border of acanthus leaves. This border lies in front of the chimney breast, thereby defining the rectangular central panel. Because of its prominence, this border is centered on the chimney breast. This is where the fruit panel will go. The final 1-inch border is added. Areas for the corner block are cut away in the same manner as for the fruit panel. In this instance, we resorted to another common Victorian decorative technique to get a special effect. We wanted to echo the sunflower panels that will flank the doors with some sunflowers on the ceiling. To do this, we cut sunflowers from another existing pattern and paste them on top of the standard rose corner blocks. This technique is known as decoupage. It is frequently found in elaborate wallpapered rooms. With a final wash, the ceiling is complete. The frieze is the traditional band that encircles the top of a Victorian room. The frieze should be centered on the chimney breast. Hanging the walls in this room is much like hanging the walls in any room, with two exceptions. First, it is cut short to allow for the dado at the bottom. Secondly, a space is provided for the sunflower panel adjacent to the door. Lastly, the companion dado is installed. Placing it under the panel makes it possible to line up the pattern exactly.
We've seen how the wallpaper was made, and we've seen how it was hung. Now, let's see how all those patterns work together in the finished room.
The main ceiling has gilded Japanese crests printed over a hazy blue background, the color that was commonly used to suggest the feeling of open sky. The enrichment is hung with a traditional Japanese basket weave pattern. The gently spiraling acanthus border is accented by two subsidiary borders in the geometric Eastlake style. Corner blocks of varying sizes permit the graceful turning of corners. The final flourish of the ceiling is provided by a panel of potted fruit that embellishes the ceiling above the entrance to the dining room, an evocation of the Victorian love of allegory. The flowering branches of the fireplace we find echoed in the flowering branches of a frieze paper designed by Christopher Dresser, one of the leading practitioners of the Eastlake Japanesque school of design. The matching wainscot, commonly called a dado, was often added to give a front parlor an air of formality. The delicate willow pattern on the walls, reminiscent of Japanese willowware, is actually derived from a pattern by the famous English designer William Morris. This restful wall pattern serves as a foil for the more elaborate ornamentation above and below it, and makes an excellent backdrop for the display of paintings and other artwork. The potted sunflowers in the fireplace are reflected by the panels of potted sunflowers that flank the bay windows and the pocket doors. The brilliant blue and orange highlights of the panels reflect the brilliant blue and orange glowing from the flashed window panes.